introducing our final presentation, I want to briefly return to a quotation that I ran out of time to give you last time. This comes from a man named Asbury Gatch. He was with the 9th Ohio Cavalry, and they're patrolling the Tennessee River in the spring of 1864. This is the letter that he wrote back home to his wife. He says, "I must say that what is called the Muscle Shoals of the Tennessee River is the prettiest river I have ever seen. The scenery is beyond description, very nice, filled with islands and romantic banks." And then he says, "Nothing occurred on our expedition farther than starvation. We left with 2 days' rations and went out 5 days. 3 days on cornmeal and water mixed in a chicken heap and burnt in the sides, remaining wet in the center. But salt was out of the question. The old planters through this country dig up the floors of their smokehouses and boil the dirt to get the old salt that had dropped from their hands in years before, when salt could be had for 1/2 cent per pound. The price is now $1.50 per pound, and not to be had at that. I tell you, my dear, you have no idea of the sufferings of the rebels down here." Now, I'm glad you all chuckled at that, because I've tried to work in instances of humor where I could, but to be quite honest, what we were talking about today, the moments of comic relief will be few and far between. Because what Gatch alludes to here is that by this point in time, the sufferings, the privations, the deprivation of the substance, the stuff of life for the everyday people living here in the Shoals would have been tremendous. And what we're going to explore today is really a disaster, the likes of which that very few of us really can imagine and have never really experienced personally. But 64 and 65 is really the bitter end in the most literal sense. This is our roadmap. I like to let you know what you're in for today. We'll briefly examine the Shoals in the context of the War of the West in the spring of 1864 and the summer of 64. Developments in Georgia, Wheeler's 1864 raid, Forrest's raid. We'll watch General Hood as he moves west, and all eyes turn towards the Shoals. We'll examine the standoff on Shoal Creek in November 1864. Instances of hardship, sacrifice, and privation on the part of the local population. We'll look at Hood's Middle Tennessee campaign and his subsequent retreat, General Wilson's mammoth encampment at Grammarly Springs, Alabama. We'll look at the spring of 65 and specifically instances of lawlessness and violence directed at the local people, and then the restoration of civil government in the summer of 1865, and we'll try and wrap it up with some final thoughts. So this is the military situation in North Alabama and the theater of war, really at the start of the period that we're discussing. Last time when we left off, we saw how the Federal Army had managed to hold on to its foothold at Chattanooga, Tennessee in the fall of 1863. And from there, in the spring of 64, General William Tecumseh Sherman is preparing for his spring campaign, his Atlanta campaign. And to that end, he is using these two rail lines from Nashville to Stevenson and from Nashville to Athens to stockpile mass quantities of material, of foodstuffs, of horses, mules, and also soldiers in preparation for his thrust into Georgia versus his opponent, Joe Johnston. Now, just because these are the only men that I've chosen to show on this map, there were a lot of other commanders and subordinate commanders in the theater at this time. In fact, it's really quite a shuffling through as Sherman is pooling all of the available sources, all hands on deck throughout the region. They're all being funneled through the Tennessee Valley towards Chattanooga. And some commanders complain actually at this point that they don't know who they're supposed to take orders from, and they don't know who they're supposed to write reports to, because a commander will be in town one day and then move out the next day, and there's some confusion about the chain of command. At Pulaski, you have this general, John C. Starkweather. He's an interesting character. His fellow generals complain that he is fond of reporting every idle rumor and gossip up the chain as though it's fact. This is not just Starkweather's problem, this is a problem in general at the time, of trying to gather intel and reconnaissance and trying to figure out the eternal question of who is where doing what. And really these generals are the eyes and ears of Sherman and the upper command. At Decatur, you have Robert Granger, who is a much more trustworthy officer, in my opinion, than Starkweather. And then on the Confederate side, you have our old friend General Roddy, the cavalry commander, and Nathan Bedford Forrest, the cavalry commander. Now, cavalry at this time, as we'll see, are really the eyes and ears of the army. And especially in the Confederate perspective, they are in short demand. Now, Sherman, throughout this period, is constantly looking back towards the Shoals, and he has Forrest hanging over his shoulder, thinking that Forrest is going to cross the Tennessee River and get behind his lines of supply and communication in Middle Tennessee. And Sherman, of course, famously calls Forrest the very devil. And Forrest is constantly vexing Sherman's plans and grand designs in Georgia by being such a wild card and such a nimble, wily manipulator. And actually, Sherman says on June 12, 1864, you may send notice to Florence that if Forrest invades the Tennessee from that direction, the town will be burned. And if it occurs, you will remove the inhabitants north of the Ohio River and burn the town at Tuscumbia also. So Sherman means what he says. And really, Florence very narrowly escapes this fate because, as we'll see later, Sherman's misgivings about the threat that Forrest poses off sides are indeed very prescient and important about the next to come. Now, the first week of May 1864, Sherman launches what will be known to history as his Atlanta campaign. Strictly speaking, though, it wasn't Sherman's strategic objective to take the city of Atlanta. His purpose was to find Joe Johnston and give him battle wherever he was. The army of Joe Johnston was Sherman's objective. Now, Johnston is basically tethered to the city of Atlanta by the rail line that leads back to that stronghold. And the railroad, of course, is supplying Joe Johnston with the material that he needs to keep his army fed and supply men and horses. So the fact that Johnston constantly has to cover his rear to make sure that he has access back to Atlanta means that Sherman, by a series of flanking maneuvers, trying to get around Joe Johnston's back, pushes him further and further down the railroad tracks as the summer of 1864 wears on. Now, over this course of time, Johnston, the Confederate general, quickly loses the support of his subordinates, most of whom believed that they could do a better job than he could. And he will eventually be fired by about the middle of July. Now, this is an observation, a personal observation, more for you military history buffs out there, but I was kind to Joe Johnston. He was fighting with a distinct disadvantage versus Sherman. And that's really a problem of the way that the Federal Army and the Confederate armies organized their division and chains of command. At this time, Sherman is the big boss. He is head of all federal forces in the Department of the Mississippi, which essentially means west of the Appalachians. His only bosses are Grant and Lee. Now, Joe Johnston is merely leader of an army, not the army. He's leader of the Army of Tennessee, but he has a number of co-equal generals throughout the theater that he basically has to ask permission to get them to cooperate with his strategic purposes. Sherman doesn't have to ask permission from anybody. He has basically plenipotentiary authority from Washington to do whatever he needs. So if Sherman wants you in Georgia, you move to Georgia. He doesn't have to ask permission from anybody. Joe Johnston, on the other hand, has to constantly ask Richmond and his fellow generals to please cooperate with his plans. For example, in writing back to Richmond to General Bragg on June 12th, Joe Johnston said, "I have urged General S.D. Lee to send his cavalry at once to break the railroad between Dalton and Getlaw. If you agree with me in the opinion that it could bring the no service in Mississippi prepared to this, I suggest you give him orders." And then to Lee himself, he says, "I earnestly suggest that Major General Forrest be ordered to take such parts as he may select." So really all Joe Johnston can do is earnestly suggest and implore and urge. Joe Johnston's biggest tool is his vocabulary, whereas Sherman is the new boss. And so it's really no surprise then that this misfire and strategic misdirection on part of the Confederates has Joe Johnston driven down the railroad tracks all summer long. But once Johnston withdraws south of the Chattahoochee, which is the final geographic barrier between Sherman's army and Atlanta, his goose is cooked, and he's fired in replacement his subordinate General John Bell Hood, who has been talking to Richmond all summer long, saying, hey, I can do a better job if he can. Joe Johnston's parting words, whenever he relinquished command to General Hood on July 17th, he said, quote, confident language by a military commander is not usually regarded as evidence of competency. That's about as sassy as Civil War generals get. Now, again, as Johnston alluded to, part of the Confederate strategy at this point is trying to break the railroad at Sherman's back, to compel him to give up and retreat back to Middle Tennessee to cover his lines of supply and shake him off the heels of Atlanta. And after Hood takes command of the Army of Tennessee, one of his first orders of business is ordering our friend Joe Wheeler on what I might call a ridiculously circuitous raid, trying to break the railroad lines in Middle Tennessee. Now, on this map that I put together, there's very, very few days, and Wheeler's report contains very few days. And I think that it's because he's covering so much ground so quickly that he doesn't really have time to stop and make note of where he is on what day. But I do have a few milestones. He leaves the Atlanta area on August 9th. There's some initial successes on the 14th of August against the federal garrison at Dalton. But the fact that there is no forage for his horses, they're only finding green corn in the country, and they have to keep going north through the valley of the Tennessee to find enough food for the men. The rivers are swollen, and so he's compelled to ford the Tennessee above Knoxville near Strawberry Plains. He crosses over the Cumberland Plateau and enters the Nashville area. And by September 6th, he is really hightailing it out of Middle Tennessee, hotly pursued by the federal cavalry under Major General Russo. And he crosses the Tennessee River somewhere around Cheatham's Ferry on September 10th. And Wheeler's raid is really tragically misdirected energy. While Wheeler is absent from the Atlanta area, Sherman's going to take the city. John Bell Hood abandons Atlanta with a bang on September 1st, 1864. I say with a bang because there was an order given to destroy the ordnance trains that couldn't be brought away from the city. So Sherman becomes aware that the Confederates have abandoned Atlanta by the massive explosion on the night of September 1st. And the Confederates abandoned Atlanta. Sherman takes the city. It's too little too late for Wheeler and his raid. I mostly include this picture because I love this image. It's a destroyed roundhouse at the Atlantic and Western Depot there in Atlanta. Whenever Sherman takes the city of Atlanta on September 1st, his orders go something like this. Move all the stores forward from Allatoona and Marietta to Atlanta. Take possession of all good buildings for government purposes and see that they are not used as quarters. Advise the people to quit now. There can be no trade or commerce now until the war is over. Let Union families go north with their effects and Secesh families move on. All cotton is tainted with treason, and no title in it will be respected. It must all go to Nashville as United States property, and pretended claimants may collect testimony for the pursuit of proceeds of the sale after they reach the U.S. Treasury in London. So Sherman comes in, he takes over all the property. He says to the people here, get lost. This is the Army's city now. If your Union, go north and wait for the war to be over. If you're secession, move along. Now, Atlanta is a watershed moment in the war, and you may be asking me, Jordan, this is the Civil War in the Shoals and the Tennessee Valley. Why are you talking about Atlanta? Oh, he has little faith. Developments at Atlanta are going to very quickly focus events back to the Shoals like a laser beam because of the aftermath of what happens here. But really, in the grand scheme of things, even earlier that summer, Abraham Lincoln is despairing openly about his chances for re-election. People were very war-weary at this time, and he said it is exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. However, whenever Sherman captures Atlanta, suddenly there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and Grant, Sherman, and Lincoln begin speaking about the end of the war. So it becomes evident to leaders in the West that, number one, Sherman has a working strategy, that he knows how to get things done, and that secondly, this war is closer to the end than it was at the beginning. Now, as I say, events at Atlanta are going to focus back to the Shoals eventually, as we work forward. After the capture of Atlanta, finally, General Forrest is ordered by his respective commander, and it'll be, it's not good, but he finally orders him forward into Tennessee to break the railroad lines to try and convince Sherman to give up Atlanta. Forrest's raid, as we'll see, I hope, is a really stunningly effective symphony of destruction. Forrest really has a penchant for being the fox in the henhouse and sneaking behind lines and causing a bunch of ruckus and havoc. And we'll see he has a number of surprising tools in his tool chest. As I say, ironically, Sherman has been looking back towards the Shoals all summer long, thinking that Forrest is about to do what he's going to do. But at the very moment that it happens, Sherman has let his guard down, because Forrest is reported in Mobile around the end of August, and he certainly was in Mobile. But Granger at Decatur, following Wheeler's raid, is very nervous that Forrest is lurking a little bit too close for comfort. But Sherman tells Grant that he has nothing to fear from Sherman tells Granger that he has nothing to fear from General Forrest. At the same time that Sherman is telling Granger at Decatur not to worry about Forrest, Forrest leaves Tupelo on September 16, 1864, heads by way of the Mobile and Ohio to Corinth, and on the 19th through the 21st of September, crosses the Tennessee River at Colbert Ferry and Colbert Shoals. And he is completely undetected by the federal authorities in the area. And this is very ironic because all summer long, as I say, they've been seeing Forrest in places where he's not. You see in the official records, and they'll say, Forrest is at Savannah with 5,000 men. Forrest is trying to cross Lamb's Ferry with 3,000 men. And commanders in the area are saying, it's not Forrest, we know where he is. They were, in other words, overactive in seeing Forrest like a boogeyman, like the sound that goes bump in the night. And part of the trouble of this is, Union commanders had gotten used to Forrest being nothing more than a crying wolf. So that by the time he actually does cross the Tennessee River in mid-September, people really have their guard down that it's actually going to be him this time. Rodney crosses the Tennessee River around Bainbridge, and they move together in the direction of Athens. And this actually very effectively covers Forrest's movement, because the only intel that passes up the federal chain of command is that Rodney has crossed the Tennessee River. They don't realize that Forrest and his forces with them. They show up at Athens on the morning of September 24th and completely catch the garrison unawares. Part of the trouble for the Federals at this point is, as I say, Sherman has really been pooling all available federal forces for the Atlanta campaign. So he's only left behind skeleton crews to guard little blockhouses and little garrisons at strategic points. So they really don't have the men and resources to resist any kind of a concerted siege. When Sherman comes upon the garrison in Athens on the morning of the 24th, he says, I demand an immediate and unconditional surrender of the entire force and all government stores and property at this post. I have a sufficient force to storm and take your works, and if I am forced to do so, the responsibility of the consequences must rest with you. Should you, however, accept the terms, all white soldiers shall be treated as prisoners of war, and the Negroes returned to their masters. A reply is requested immediately. It's very obvious then that for the black servicemen at these garrisons, capture meant not only the possibility of death, but of being returned in chains to bondage in the South. And the commander of the federal garrison here, Colonel Campbell, is stalling. Forrest invites him to review his troops to see how serious his threat is, and Campbell is dawdling, expecting that reinforcements are going to come from Decatur. He doesn't know that those reinforcements have already been defeated and have hightailed back to Decatur. So high noon on the 24th, he surrenders the garrison at Athens. This is a seriously unpopular and ignominious decision on the part of Colonel Campbell. The other officers who are surrendered later wrote a letter kind of trying to vindicate their honor. And they actually said that the soldiers were anxious to try conclusions with General Forrest, believing that in such a work they could not be taken by 10 times their number. When told that the fort had been surrendered and that they were prisoners, they could scarcely believe themselves, but with tears demanded that the fight should go on, preferring to die in the fort that they had made to being transferred to the tender mercies of General Forrest and his men. but the Athens garrison is surrendered. And immediately, alarm bells start ringing in the federal officer corps throughout the West. In response to this, General Sherman sends back General Thomas with an entire division back to Atlanta, back to Nashville, to try and get a handle on this situation. Forrest is far from done, however. This is a map that I created, by the way, showing Forrest's progress through Middle Tennessee in his raid. He famously moves from Atlanta to Sulphur Creek Trestle, where the little blockhouse garrison gallantly defends themselves for several hours before being out of ammunition and forced to capitulate to Forrest as well. Many of them are also PIPOC, people of color who are in uniform and are sent back south in chains back to bondage. And Forrest crosses Elk River and assails Pulaski. By this time, General Russo has caught up with him. Pulaski does not capitulate. He moves on towards the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad in the direction of Tullahoma. And around Fayetteville, he decides to split his force. He sends a detachment under General Buford south towards Huntsville, and he moves his direction back towards the Nashville area, towards Franklin. Now, by this point, Forrest is really a victim of his own success. He's very nearly out of ammunition, having invested multiple fortified locations. So he is almost out of artillery. He's actually lost a lot of men as well, sending prisoners back down south. They have to have some kind of military escort. So he's been sending his forces down south to guard prisoners. He's out of ammunition because he's been assailing all these blockhouses. So the situation for him, he's really become a victim of his own success. But nevertheless, really a powerful tool in his toolkit of symphony of destruction is the psychological element that Forrest represents, and the fear of the people inside these blockhouses about what he can possibly do to them and their commands. So whenever General Buford makes his appearance at Huntsville on the 30th, he brings a missive from Forrest. And Forrest says to the garrison, the Union garrison at Huntsville, "I expect to attack you tomorrow morning from every rock, house, tree, and shrub in the vicinity. And feeling confident of my ability to succeed in my anticipated attempt, now bid you prepare yourself for the fray." That kind of psychological element of demanding a surrender and bidding your enemy to prepare for the fray is really a powerful tool in Forrest's kit, and especially in lieu of the fact, and he's very well aware of the fact that he's almost out of ammunition. So really, he's got to talk a big game because he doesn't really have a lot of bang where his buck is. But nevertheless, he does compel the surrender of more blockhouses and burns trestle work between Spring Hill and Columbia. But after Spring Hill and Columbia, he's out of ammunition to the point that if he stays in Middle Tennessee, then he won't even be able to defend his own retreat. So by October 1st, he and his men are in flight. And they're really working their way down the modern US Highway 43, down from like Mount Pleasant, Lawrenceburg, crossing the state line near Greenville. By October 5th, Forrest has reached Florence, and he is hotly pursued by federal cavalry in the form of General Russo and federal infantry in the direction of Huntsville, who have also been sent back from Atlanta to intercept him. And although 2 weeks earlier, Forrest and his men forded the Tennessee River on horseback, the river was low enough in the middle of September that his men simply rode their horses across Culver Shoals. Whenever he reaches Florence on October 5th, he finds that the river is flooded, and that the water is moving so fast that his ferry boats are having difficulty ferrying the men across. But he has really little choice at this moment because federal forces are at Shoal Creek and pressing hotly every month. So Forrest, in one of those moments of the war that just seems, truth being stranger than fiction, like, did that really happen? Well, he says it did. Forrest, he orders his men to mount their horses and swim the Tennessee River. They get on horseback and swim to an island in the middle of the Tennessee River. He doesn't say which island. Could be Coger's Island, could be 7 Mile Island. But they swim the Tennessee River out of the range of federal sharpshooters, and all of his men are ferried over in safe. And it really is the the crowning achievement sort of this raid that he loses so few men and takes so much from the Federal Army at such a relatively little cost to himself and his men. Now, I'm kind of a weather nerd, like meteorology, and I'm always interested whenever reports of the weather make it into the official records and the official reports, because it's not just an incidental detail. When you consider not only the strategies of commanders having to contend with bad weather, with inclement weather, but then also what it's like to be a soldier, out marching through the muck and the mire, the rain, the cold, and the sleet. And a Lieutenant Colonel James Langley of the 125th Illinois is one of the men who's marching west from Huntsville to try and intercept Forrest. And he writes a very revealing detail in his report. He says, up to this time, from the day of our departure from Atlanta, it rained heavily every day, rendering the roads from Athens to Florence very muddy, besides swelling the numerous streams to their banks. These streams we were compelled to ford, with the exception of Shoal Creek, which had a good bridge. The men were drenching wet, adding greatly to the weight of their loads, and their sleep, though sound, was the sleep of exhaustion, and afforded them but little rest. Besides, many were barefoot and footsore. Those who fell sick by the wayside were left in the houses to the care of the citizens, as we had no means of transportation. The citizens, as far as I was able to learn, uniformly treated our sick soldiers with a great deal of kindness. I do not hesitate to say that our trip from Atlanta to Florence came nearer tasking to the utmost the physical endurance of the American soldier than any campaign I ever witnessed, and I cannot withhold the meed of praise so eminently due to the brave officers and men who made it. I include this as well because he includes this detail about the 6 soldiers who fell by the wayside being cared for in the homes of the citizens along the line of march. And this is a very common occurrence during the war, during the Shoals. And I include that because, I mostly center that Pope's Tavern now with Florence Arts and Museums. And of course, one of the historical details that's reported about Pope's is that it was used as a hospital for Union and Confederate soldiers during the war. Well, it probably was. Any antebellum structure that was anywhere near where soldiers happened to be would have been used as some kind of makeshift hospital. And we see that here from Langley's report that any house nearby where soldiers were was used as a hospital in absence of any real resources that the military or government could provide. Now, ironically, as with Wheeler's raid, Forrest's raid, although it is much more destructive in its immediate impacts, really backfires in its larger strategic significance. Because while Forrest decides to withdraw south of the Tennessee River and go offside somewhere else, Sherman is going to send back pools of reinforcements to Middle Tennessee. He's not going to be caught so unawares again. And General Thomas is going to be left in charge of the situation at Nashville, because the situation in Atlanta has undergone a significant change. General John Bell Hood, after surrendering the city of Atlanta, tries to throw Sherman off of his designs in Georgia by breaking the railroad back to Chattanooga. This is really too little too late from a strategic standpoint, because by this point, Sherman has already decided that the railroads are more trouble than they're worth. And he is not going to try and supply his men and horses with every morsel of food that they need and every bit of ammunition that they need with long, cumbersome supply lines back to the Ohio River. No, sir. He's going to take total war to Georgia, and he's going to cause the citizens living there in the southern heartland to subsidize the movements of his army. So breaking the railroad between Chattanooga and Atlanta is really too little too late from Hood's perspective. And when he realizes this, really around the second week of October, Hood decides on a far more grand course of action to try and throw Sherman off of the throat of the southern heartland of Georgia. Now, Sherman, all the while, is watching Hood and watching this take place. And Grant and Washington are really nervous about this, about Hood possibly invading Middle Tennessee, or even going further down south and trying to get around Sherman. But Sherman really just wants to let him go. If Hood goes to Tennessee, then that's one less thing for him to have to worry about in Georgia. He actually at one point said, invite him to invade Middle Tennessee. Send him a free pass in. If Hood gets out of Sherman's business, then that just leaves him to his work of destruction. So for a certain in the middle of October, it's really up in the air whether Sherman is going to follow Hood west or whether he's going to just let him go. And Sherman actually follows Hood to about Galesville, Alabama, in Cherokee County on the Coosa River. But once Hood passes Gadsden on October 20th, Sherman says, let it go. I've got men enough in Middle Tennessee under Thomas to handle him, and I'm going to take total war to Georgia on my march to the sea. And Hood actually, he originally intends to invade Middle Tennessee by way of Frenchman's Landing, but he's not able to do so because he has miscommunication with cavalry or Forrest. The infantry absolutely depends on cavalry for their movements at this time because they're the eyes and ears of the army. And he cannot coordinate successfully with General Forrest, who's gallivanting off in West Tennessee. So he does not cross the river at Gunnsville and keeps moving west in the direction of the Shoals and arrives at Decatur on October 26th. And the result of this is the three-day Battle of Decatur. There's some beautiful photographs here that have survived this. You can very clearly recognize the old state date, the old state bank here at Decatur, and the earthworks that are being thrown up by Union soldiers and laborers. You've noticed several people of color here in the group photo. This is the garrison commander, Robert Granger. Now, whenever Hood appears at Decatur, the little garrison here just behaves gallantly. They really are not daunted, although Hood is bringing to bear the entire army of Tennessee, something on the order of 30,000 men versus a garrison of scarcely 5,000. And among them are so-called USCI, U.S. colored troops is how they're referred to at the time, people of color in uniform actually fighting for the Stars and Stripes, men who had been liberated from bondage in North Carolina. And the Confederates really, they give the Federals a run for their money and encircled the city of Decatur, but as I say, the garrison behaves gallantly, and the USCI is charged with a weighty responsibility in trying to break through some of those Confederate lines. A very brief quote here. They were cautioned that a battery was to be charged to take it. If only 10 men survived to take it. They manifested no undue excitement or fear, but seemed anxious for the work. These are men who, like Charles Tyree, are eager to prove themselves that they are just as good of a fighting soldier as any other white soldier. And they really received the accolades and praise of the officer corps, whose attitudes towards black servicemen are really starting to change here, in large part because of their gallantry at places like Decatur. I don't believe that Hood really made an earnest attempt to cross the Tennessee River at Decatur. He could have really invested the place and tried to cross there, but he is moving further west towards the Shoals. The reason Hood is moving west towards the Shoals is because his men need food to eat, his horses need food to eat, and they also need shoes. And Tuscumbia, at the end of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad from Corinth, the part that was still serviceable, has become their supply depot. So he's moving west in the direction of Tuscumbia so that his men can have a chance to get something to eat, get some new shoes, and then cross at leisure, and he can finally hook up with General Forrest.